Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and you're interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you that there are 2 upcoming NARM therapist trainings starting in January 2022. One of these trainings will be offered in an online format, and the other will be offered in person in San Francisco, California. This Level 2 NARM therapist training is designed to support mental health professionals who work with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Being trained in NARM, one of the first clinical models specifically designed to address ACEs and C-PTSD, supports therapists to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The NARM therapist training will be taught by NARM senior faculty Brad Kammer and a team of experienced NARM training assistants. You will learn a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach. As you're learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from this team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers. If you're interested in this training, we encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. And now for today's guest. Becky Carter is a trauma therapist, somatic practitioner, and speaker. She specializes in somatic healing and resilience with regards to the embodiment of racialized trauma and oppression. Please enjoy my conversation with Becky Carter. Hello, Becky. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you. It's good to be asked. Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation today.
Me too.
I have no idea what we're going to get into, but whatever it is, it's going to be great.
I feel the same.
Yeah. Well, we start off these interviews by asking guests, what would you really like for listeners to get out of our time together today?
My hope is that listeners can take a little time to touch into the somatic impact of racial trauma, and that I can communicate as much as I can in the time we have together about all the ways that racial trauma weaves its way through so much of people's existence. It weaves its way through development. It weaves its way through community, through body, through voice, through relationships, ancestrally and culturally, and through all systems and embodied systems. I'm hoping to share a little bit about my sense of the impact of that. My hopes allow for some much more in-depth conversations about what's going on in our world and what's really settling into our skin and our bones around racial issues. That might be a tall order for our time together, but I hope I can get a little of that out.
Yes. And I'm ready to dig in. But before we go right into it, tell people who you are and what you're doing.
Yeah. So I'm a therapist, and I've been practicing for almost 20 years now, primarily working with complex PTSD. So looking at the long-term, chronic, ongoing compound traumas that people have experienced, and looking at even also the dissociative aspects of complex PTSD, and really trying to kind of from prenate on, right? Even what happens in utero and beyond, coming into a not safe world, a not predictable world, or neglectful world, and how to reconfigure and find sense of self amidst that, have relationships, sense of purpose and meaning. And so most of my work has been in that realm. I do quite a bit with adoption and working with adoptees, adoptive parents around issues of trauma and loss and attachment in adoption, and have done quite a bit of training and therapy with families around transracial adoption issues. So starting early to talk about race in my work, and I'll share a little bit. I've been talking about race for some time personally, and I'll share a little bit about that. But I started to shift more into working, just kind of happened naturally with the clients that were coming to me with sexual trauma. So working with both male and female survivors of sexual trauma, and I do groups for male survivors currently. which is a really rewarding experience because creating a space where men feel like they can come in and talk with other men about such an incredibly vulnerable and shame-inducing topic is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And I do have some clients of color who are also survivors, and what that element brings in terms of additional layers of shame, additional layers of voicelessness and oppression that shows up, and how to find voice as a person of color around sexual trauma issues. So that's very dear to my heart. So yeah, so I'm doing those groups. I've trained in somatic experiencing. I do some transformative touch work. And probably for the past, I'd say 3 years now, really started after reading my grandmother's hands, Resmaa Menakem's
Yeah.
book. I started really diving into the embodiment of race, the embodiment of oppression,
Mm-hmm.
and starting to try to more intentionally weave that into my work. It's always been woven in, but bringing in the embodied piece and helping clients explore that and finding ways to help them bring voice to their experiences is a little bit more recent, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
And since George Floyd's murder, I'd say I've been doing quite a bit of that in the SE community and beyond, anti-racism groups,
Mm-hmm.
just doing Zoom trainings about how therapists, white and therapists of color, can start to really flex those muscles around how to look at their own biases and how they hold those in their bodies, also supporting their clients in creating a safer space to bring a more diverse clientele in, how to repair injury, and how to work racial trauma through the body. So that's just more professionally. Personally, I bring other pieces.
Yeah. Do you want to share that as well?
Sure, sure. I am an adoptee. So I was adopted into my family at 10 months of age. I am biracial, so I'm part Black and I'm part white. The white side, mostly Sicilian, Italian. Black side, mostly Nigerian, West African.
Mm-hmm.
So at 10 months old, my little brown body was delivered into the hands of this white family. How I've grown from that unique experience, what's been challenging about it, what has felt mirroring in terms of kind of my sense of self, and what has felt a little bit in terms of like missing as a result of not being reflected by people who look like me.
Mm-hmm.
So really early on in my life, starting to get a sense that, kind of walking parallel to a lot of worlds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not completely in a white world as a biracial person, having some assigned privilege living in a white family, but also being a person of color, sometimes not being Black enough for the Black community,
Mm-hmm.
but still experiencing different types of racism, judgment, microaggressions, oppression, and trying to find a way to come to terms with impact, and also realizing how much I was afforded and strides I was able to make in my life as a result of some white privilege that I grew up around.
Mm-hmm.
So really helping to that fight response in me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which has been really present for quite some time, starting to get a sense of the appease that was behind that fight response and how much I'd been appeasing in so many situations.
Mm-hmm. The fawn response, right?
The fawn response,
Yeah.
right? Everybody else wanted me to be. And some of that came from developmental trauma from being adopted, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the sense of abandonment and 10 months in a foster home and kind of going from different families' hands to the next. And trying to make sense of that. And I was fighting to be seen and to be heard and understood. But the story got even more interesting when I married a white man, and now we have 2 adopted Black children. We have a Black 8-year-old son. My daughter is 12 years old, and she's also Black. So, being a multiracial family,
Mm-hmm.
parenting kiddos with their own developmental issues as a result of adoption, and supporting them being in a multiracial family.
Wow.
Yeah.
As you're talking about that, I was thinking about all the different layers, right? And starting with you, right? So the layer
Mm-hmm.
of being born in a brown body, as you said, then the piece of being adopted, period, then the piece of being in a foster home for 10 months, and then being adopted, period, then
Yes.
being adopted by a white family, right? All of these different layers. And
Yes.
goodness, I'm kind of like visualizing some sort of like tree with roots and what grows underneath and how we then like pull on different threads and work with different aspects in order to support healing. That's not a question, but do you have any thoughts on what I just said?
The image is one that is powerful for me. And there is actually an image that shows a tree coming up from the ground with, its trunk and its roots and its leaves. And then it goes down into the ground, right? And the roots that extend out, which represent the birth family with adoption. But I also feel there's an ancestral energy to those roots in that image that go down into the earth.
Right.
And it really wasn't until I started to come to terms with what was my personal embodied activation, energy, vibrations in my body that were a result of being in this very unique family situation, in this unique world we're living in, being a person of color today and
in America.
In America,
Yeah.
right? And then also just the sense of what's ancestry? What's this wordless embodied narrative where you have a felt sense of something, a felt sense of connection, a felt sense of an embodied history, that it's those roots that extend down into the ground and they run so deep and they come up through our layers, they come up through our bones, they come up through our fascia, our muscles, into our skin. And if we're lucky enough, we bring voice to those too. And it wasn't until I started doing more developmental trauma work, somatic work, that I, through my layers, started to find voice and being able to name some things that I was feeling into that really brought more pieces together with regards to my story, my narrative. What was missing, what maybe happened that shouldn't have, and what didn't happen that should have.
And as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the U.S., at least this is what I've been told in anti-racist circles, that the U.S. has a really terrible memory for history in general. Because as you were talking about the roots, I was thinking like, wow, I don't feel that. I don't feel that connection. And I wonder how many other white people would say the same thing, because we're white, whatever. Like, unless you're like, have a full blood Italian or Irish family or whatever, we don't necessarily get connected to that history. And so white supremacy really that's how white people get affected, right? That's how white people get robbed, especially because we're not taught to look back. We're not taught that there's anything of importance there. And yet it's still there.
It's still there. And when I do trainings on this topic, and I have an activity, it's an ancestral guided imagery activity I do. And even the white-bodied folks who are at the training, they're like, wow, lots came up in that activity. If they're actually given space, what they flesh out, what they sense into and bring voice to that, they're pretty amazed. But no, it's not something that is nurtured in white bodies, and definitely not something that's nurtured in bodies of color. And when it comes to history, I mean, talk about being robbed, right? As a culture in the US, there's really such minimal information taught about kind of Black history, about what, the history of race, concepts of white supremacy, white fragility, and, the luxury of not having to teach that, being in this white dominant world, but the damage that does even to white bodies, not understanding what they come in to their relationships and to the classroom with, what's constricted within their systems as a result of, a white supremacist culture. And Resmaa in his book asks, white bodies to really sit and reflect in an embodied way about what they hold and why they hold it, where they feel more expanse, where they feel more constriction, and to really start to, as we do in the somatic world, and it is kind of coming into a sense of what it's like to sit with a little bit of discomfort while being anchored with resources, anchored with things that feel a little bit more grounding and stabilizing, regulating, which is so much what the healing, I think, for racial trauma is where are the places where people of color feel like they can be safer, braver, more reflected, heard, not microaggressed against? Where do they not have to take care of people's white fragility and what that feels like in their bodies?
Right. Yeah, I've heard some of my Black friends talk about being in Black only spaces and the release, the surrender, the letting go. I
Mhm.
see you taking a breath as I even say that, right? That just sounds like I mean, again, we're like, I don't know why robbing is the metaphor that we're using today, but like to be robbed of that experience
Yeah.
and then for them to have that just sounds so beautiful and so to be met, right?
Yes. And then I think we can even say that looking at this idea of being robbed, that for bodies of color, when you come into the world, especially this white, US world, we come into a world that sees us a certain way. We know how
Mhm.
early research shows us that there's judgments about the
Oh,
color of skin,
how
and
early?
that
At what age?
it's as little as preschool,
Mm.
that there's children are starting to make distinctions and differentiations between race and what it affords you, what might be
Oh,
better, more attractive.
wow.
And I know that for me, when my little brown body came into the world, that I came into the hands of oppression. I know this just from my birth family history.
Mm.
And part of that was based on the color of my skin.
Hmm.
Part of the reason I was surrendered, in with adoption
Oh.
was a result of skin color. So this is the developmental piece, right? So it's
Mm.
the idea of not being raw, but never knowing anything different than that sense of shame as a result of something that you don't have
That
control
you
over.
just
And that's the
are,
skin you're in.
right?
So the work is actually kind of coming into a new sense of embodying oneself that you haven't experienced before when you are witnessed or reflected or supported by other bodies of color.
Mm.
For me, it can be a Black person, it can be a Latinx person, it can be an
Mhm.
Asian person, anybody who's experienced oppression and knows what it's like to be reflected by them is really powerful. It's really 100 times more powerful to come face to face with another biracial person who understands the components, right, of being in Black and white skin,
Mhm.
and how it really shifts your cellular structure to
Mm.
be that reflected,
Mm.
right? When you come into a world feeling like you're either too much or that the way you show up is not okay. You are not okay.
Right.
So, yeah, really powerful, really
Mm.
powerful.
Well, I'm curious. I don't know if you can speak to this, so no pressure to do so, but a couple of my light-skinned Black friends have talked about that privilege of having light skin, but they're not biracial. And I guess I'm just curious about what's different and what's similar about the light skin privilege and the pressure to not be Black enough.
Yes. It's so interesting. Well, one of the things I found is that, you can have a conversation with, 5 different light skinned Black people. They're going to have a very different story to tell you, right? So I think I always have this caveat of being really careful about making any generalizations about what it might feel like for one person to be in their lighter skinned brown skin, right?
Absolutely.
And I know for me, I really try to just, kind of put myself in the realm of what it was like for me with my single experience. And I know my life might have been a little different if I had 2 parents of color
Mm.
and was a little bit, lighter skin. Perhaps I would have felt more reflected growing up in that family. I might have
Mm.
felt a little bit more understood, seen, and heard. But, that's presuming that if I had parents of color, that they would meet those needs in
Right.
other ways, right? But I would imagine I would feel a little bit different about my embodied self than being brown growing up in a white family.
Mhm.
And, my parents did a really good job. My adoptive parents, trying to nurture what I was naturally bringing to them,
Mm.
right? To be able to have the conversations openly about it, what it's like to be the brown person in your class, what it feels like to be adopted, to be different, and very open, I'd say relatively woke parents for, doing an adoption, closed adoption in 1973. We didn't know as much about the impact of transracial adoption as we do now. So
Mhm.
now, while my parents were still living, my adoptive parents, as everyone got older, we just started having more in-depth conversations about race and impact and things they wish they would have done differently, things I wish they would have done differently, but also knowing that I filled the gaps with what was missing, and that was kind of part of my survival, kind of skill set. And
Well, that was actually one of my questions. You read my
Mhm.
mind. Is
Yeah.
what did you wish they would have done differently?
I think I wish they would have been more, I would say, proactive about conversations about how it feels to not have as much brown around me and what they could be doing, if anything more, right, to
Mm,
help me feel a little bit more reflected in more situations. Went to a
mm,
very diverse school. So I grew up in Waukegan, Illinois. It was a diverse community. But I think just, having questions about what it feels like. Are there parts about being part Black, and being Black is kind of what I say now, it's in me, right? That I felt like I didn't get nurtured as much as they could have been.
mm,
And there were a few of those, like just feeling like I having a little bit more of a focus on Black history, more conversations about race relations, about what types of conversations I was having with my friends, which ones was I not having, maybe why, and what that was forming internally for me with regards to a sense of self and identity. But they did a pretty darn good job, given what they knew. To college professors, they did better than many
mhm,
adoptive parents who are doing transracial adoptions do.
mm,
I would say that there is a bit of a gratitude for what they had the capacity to do while I was growing up with them. But there's also an incredible gratitude now for coming into awareness of birth family. I know both of my birth parents on
mm,
each side now, and what's been embodied that they couldn't have ever taught me because
mm,
of just actually knowing a birth father, knowing a birth mother, looking at my Black father and what that means in terms of honoring a part of myself that I was really looking forward to having honored and
mm.
supported. Yeah. And
Yeah.
same with the Sicilian side. That's the incredible cure for developmental trauma, right? Is just meeting your makers in a different way, right?
Mm,
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah.
right. Well, I'm curious too to really tie this in very specifically with trauma, how your, I guess, awareness isn't the right word, but essentially what I'm guessing is that the more you learned about trauma, the more you recognized what you had experienced that maybe was in and out of your awareness at different aspects. But I find the education of being a trauma therapist, it's like, oh, looking back, wish I would have known that at the time. And I'm just curious how your learning about trauma has informed your personal work, your personal knowing about your ancestral history, all of that.
Yes, I think it has. And I think as we're all really coming into awareness now, as the therapeutic community, there's still a lot missing.
Hmm.
So I think when I started to hear about and learn more about complex PTSD and the idea of it's not just the outward direct contact abusive situations that can create trauma, I started to enter into really my world. I had some direct contact traumatic experiences, even pre adoption. But I think that starting to get a sense of it's the relational piece, it's that
Hmm.
attachment piece, it's the ruptures, the neglect, the inconsistent, dysregulated, and
Hmm.
disorganized attachment pieces. When I started to learn more about that, I was like, oh, here's the world that, it really resonates with me. And it tended to be the clients that I was drawn to, is the ones that had a combination of both abuse and neglect and those early roots of attachment ruptures that created this platform of vulnerability and a real fragile kind of energy coming into later life traumas. And so I think the complex PTSD world and learning about that was incredibly helpful. I then went into the IFS world. I started doing
Hmm.
some training in internal family systems and Dick Schwartz's model. I was like, ooh, yeah, parts, right? We all have got parts. Was learning about dissociation at the same time and how to work with people who are diagnosed with full dissociative identity disorder or have moments where they might dissociate for short periods of time, the whole spectrum. This idea of parts of us and that we can have different emotional parts and what those mean and how those serve to protect the fragile parts of ourselves. all the ways in which we can do things in our lives to try to avoid connecting with those fragile parts. IFS really helped to kind of frame that. And so did the dissociative model. And then coming into the somatic world and learning about it's a really bottom up. That's when things really started to make sense to me, that it is our body that can give us so much information about what we experience as safe and what we experience as threatening. And that to be able to listen to my body as a woman of color, right? And connect with it and know that it has something to tell me and it has its own wisdom, that's been transformative. That has been incredibly transformative. Nothing, I would say, has had the impact as the whole somatic world of therapy has in that area. And so I try to model that in my work. And a lot of people are terrified to go into their bodies. I'm terrified to go into parts of my body. I still am, but I know that. And I have a narrative as to why. And that's empowering. And I can find my no and my embodied no about where I don't want to go and why. And that's empowering, especially for the early developmental trauma.
Yeah. So I'm also curious to how you think things have shifted since you mentioned George Floyd's murder, and something has shifted, right? In the collective, we can feel it. How do you make sense of it? What are you noticing?
Well, that's a big question. There's a lot of layers to it. For myself, I'm noticing a little bit of movement into mobilization for myself and the people around me. As a person of color, that is coupled with some distrust, right? So I think one of the reasons I'm trying to do these trainings is it's so easy to get complacent. Very easy to become desensitized to what we're seeing. And being pulled to pull in a sensitization, to take people out of the dissociated places that they've been. Not just white bodies, but even some bodies of color, into association of what's going on around us, more graphically in front of us because of all the ways we have to record things, and what's been going on for centuries. So I think there's also a bit of a rage at this awakening to something that has been waters that have been stirring for so long. And all it took was a few variables and kind of the perfect variables, unfortunately, to bring to the surface things that have just been sitting underneath. And that's a lot of, white supremacist, othering, traumatizing, brutalizing oppression and treatment of bodies of color. I feel moments of hope amidst this, and I feel more hopeful each time I have these conversations. I'm asked to do things like this, more hopeful every time I am able to hear people teach about the subject or to communicate my feelings about racial trauma. But I know that there is a very specific group of people who are accessing those things. So when it comes to hope for the full systemic racism, the way that is woven into every system that we have, I think that's a little harder, right? There's so much work to be done. There's a lot of amazing people who are starting to shift and add breadth and depth to the way they're going at this topic, and social justice and diversity and equity and inclusion, content in the systems they're in. There are more white bodies who have influence in areas that some bodies of color don't, to say some really important things and hopefully shift things. That's powerful, and that gives me some hope. But it's coupled with fear. And because each time I do a training, sometimes there's a week between a training, sometimes there's 2 weeks. There's been, several other bodies of color brutalized or murdered. So keeping voice amidst this ongoing storm is challenging, quite a muscle to flex.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. One of my friends is a person of color, and I talk about this a lot. And she said she was with a woman this weekend who had kids, and they were talking about just everything that's happening. And the kids started talking about, yeah, we didn't learn, XYZ in history, and this is actually the real history. And, we need to fight for social justice. And the kids were like 12 and 13 or something like that. And my
Yeah.
friend was like, wow, I felt so
Oh,
hopeful hearing
yeah.
that, at least there's one, parent who's doing something good with the next generation.
Oh, 100%. And it's really neat to see like the anti-racism groups that are coming out, some of the ones I've
Mm-hmm.
spoken to, and the commitment to the work. And I think it's incredible to hear young voices talk about what they get excited about with regards
Mm-hmm.
to race and justice. And even for my little kiddos, as much as we can safely and appropriately inform them of what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
we do. And to get them talking and thinking through what it means to be them right now in this world and what their kind of future is going to look like around this. They're going to have their own additional challenges and struggles and things that they're going to come up against, right? So I think
Mm-hmm.
if we can get our kiddos empowered and having voice at an early age, that's beautiful. It's beautiful
Mm-hmm.
because so many voices of color are silenced. If you're brown or black and you're angry, then you're scary and you're threatening.
Right.
So for brown and black bodies to have voice that's not paired with being judged or with the presumption of threat, right,
Mm-hmm.
is incredibly, incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And with healing these sorts of traumas, I think about my great grandparents and what they didn't know about trauma and mental health, right? And then how we're slowly learning more. It's so funny.
Mhm.
We've been human for so long now, but we still don't get it. We still don't get what it means to be human. But
Right.
but we do keep learning. We keep applying that learning. And my hope is that there eventually one day can be a person walking out there who's actually not traumatized.
Mm. It's an interesting concept, right? And I know we're in this field. So as you say that, there's like this, maybe? I don't know.
Right.
There's a lot of like, it lands in kind of my little developmentally kind of traumatized brain where I'm like, what? What is that? I don't know.
Right.
But that's ideally why I think, I'm in this work to begin with, is to
Right.
have less trauma, to have more people walking through the world carrying less bracing, less stress, less fear,
Mm-hmm.
wanting to move into relationship with love and curiosity and compassion and with less judgment and less narcissism and less ego and it would be great. It would be awesome. And I think generationally there's a lot that gets trickled down. Some of the good stuff that gets trickled down, some of the bystander, pieces. Let's turn a blind eye. Let's not look at this. Or we're going to look at the issues of race. We'll look at them when it's around MLK Day for a couple weeks at best, maybe
Right.
a few take home assignments, right? And then that's it. Then we shut the books,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then all the people of color keep wandering through the world with these stories and these narratives. So
Right.
I think, we know so much more about impact now. We just have to take that
Mm-hmm.
and weave it, which Ibram Kendi talks so eloquently about in all of his anti-racist books and work, about how to weave this into educational systems
Right.
and helping bodies of color come into learning about their own history in an empowered way and what white systems, what they need to do to create more space
Right.
for that learning.
Mm-hmm.
And what's been taught that's not correct,
Right.
that's not factual.
Well, not only what's been taught that's not factual, but also how we're teaching kids to learn. I
Yes.
listened to a podcast called, the series is Seen on Radio. That's like the whole podcast. And they have different seasons. And one of the seasons is all about democracy. And one of the episodes was on education. And it didn't even occur to me until I heard them talk about, once we started teaching for the test, we
Mm-hmm.
stopped teaching people how to engage. We stopped teaching people critical thinking, and now how that's manifesting in the culture, because that probably started right before like I went into school. I'm
Mm-hmm.
guessing I was born in 79. And then now how we're seeing it play out with people truly not having developed the capacity to hold nuance. And all
Yes,
of these conversations require such nuance.
you bet. And interpersonal engagement and attunement.
Right.
And this idea of, yes, we're teaching for the test, we're teaching not the process of learning
Right.
and the relational process of learning that is missing and the
Right.
critical thinking and the considering. developing curiosity, right? That's human, right?
Right.
That's what makes us so cool, right? As human beings, is we have those capacities, think so abstractly. And as we're trying to work with healing trauma, we're about let's find that window of tolerance. Let's find that place where
Mm-hmm.
we're regulated and we're feeling like we can rest and we can be present with other. But yes, we are educated in systems that actually restrict experiences. There's much less experience of being present with other. And there's less room to nurture social engagement and to nurture curiosity about self and others. And that's what also breeds racism.
Exactly.
Right.
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 Because if we were developing curiosity, then more people would be questioning the curriculums that don't involve the history of other cultures.
Exactly. Yeah. So interwoven into all the systems, right?
Absolutely. Mm.
Be powerful.
Yeah. Well, tell me what you're excited about in terms of your work right now. Is there, you said before we started that you're really interested in the touch work. And I'm so curious how you are, first of all, how are you utilizing that in the pandemic? And second of all, how are you utilizing that to support people of color in their healing?
Yes. So this is interesting. So with the pandemic, obviously, I'm not doing this in person. I was doing it before, probably had a good year and a half of practicing before the pandemic hit.
Mm.
I will say I miss it. I miss being able to touch into people's nervous systems and bringing kind of my own regulation, presence, and attunement more directly to healing.
Mm.
However, I'm really excited to see how much using intentional touch work, which is verbalizing an intention with consent and permission to provide support almost in an imagined way to certain parts of the body where
Mm.
there's more stress held, whether that
Mm.
be a brainstem, whether that be a kidney, whether that be a certain joint or something that's braced in a fight response. And so I'm really surprised to see how much impact positively I've seen with using it intentionally and then looking forward to being able to do it again in person. And that there's something I think, especially for people of color and my clients of color, to be invited to check into their bodies, that someone's holding curiosity, especially another person of color is holding curiosity about their bodies or might wonder to them, hey, as you talk to me about that really difficult, challenging thing, part of me is curious if it would feel helpful or useful to imagine, should it feel okay to you, that I provide a little support just on, the back of your shoulder there, as I see your shoulder bracing, as I see it tensing, right? And if it feels okay, and looking to make sure they're not overriding, because there's a
Right.
whole bunch of ways that bodies of color have learned to appease,
Mm-hmm.
fawn, and override. And probably half my work is identifying when that's happening
Right.
and helping them notice what's incongruent between
Yes.
voice and body.
Yeah.
But just to offer to a body of color support, a gentle, intentional touch when they're sitting with ancestral energy and imagery of lynchings and brutalization, right? And what they see on the news with all of the police violence against bodies
Mm-hmm.
of color. The idea of a gentle touch and attuned other, someone witnessing and wanting to move into their body of color, someone not fearing, someone just trying to create a safe space for all of them is really powerful work. And so I'm thrilled that I'm able to do it this way. It'll be great to do it in person again, but it's actually been nice to titrate slowly into the work by doing it through telehealth and just the idea of someone thinking about supporting you at a certain, part of activation that you might be holding.
Mm-hmm.
And then, later on, maybe you actually put that into action when you start doing the table work, in
Mm.
person. So, yeah, pretty
Mm.
powerful.
This is a little bit of a non sequitur, but
Mhm.
as you were talking, have you seen the United States versus Billie Holiday?
No, I still have to.
It's really impactful. It's really impactful. And I was just thinking about, her as an unlikely activist, right? You would never necessarily think that, a jazz singer, right? But her song Strange Fruit, talking about the lynchings. And I'm just thinking, and she was a heroin addict, just all of the trauma. I think she was born in a house of prostitution. Like there's all these things, right? And just thinking about what it would have been like, for somebody like her to be held, to be touched in such a consensual way. How healing.
How incredibly healing. And it's interesting you bring up Billie Holiday, because Nina Simone is one of my favorite artists, another activist and incredible musician, incredible voice, brought so much to civil rights and a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, very traumatized woman. She sang through that deep bass, that traumatized voice, but with such power. And we actually named my daughter after Nina Simone. Her name is Nina.
Oh.
And it is very powerful to think about, my poor kiddos, my daughter loves touch work. And so, sometimes I just like to support and touch into her, and really trying to, when I do that, witness all of her, right? Witness that brown skin, right? Witness all of what she's holding ancestrally, kind of holding this positive, hopeful energy for her descendants, and holding her at present in this kind of more vulnerable place that children are in right now in the world we're in. And to me, that ideally ripples out. If she's being held and supported, that gets into her cells and that gets into her DNA. And then she thinks in an embodied way about ideally how impactful it was for her to be held, and wants to bring that forward. And, touch is a scary thing. Touch is often part of trauma for a lot of folks. So healing touch it's been incredible for me. And I think it's been the missing piece in my work that I didn't know was missing, that I'm now moving into learning more about.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap up, this has just been such a wonderful conversation. Is there anything that you didn't say or that I didn't ask that you really want to make sure you bring forth today?
It's interesting because I think about this question. I get it, whether it comes to me or whether I'm wrapping up a training. I'm thinking about what else did I miss anything else I wanted to say? And what I've started to do is shift into my body in those moments, right? And, what my body has to tell me. And, if there's parts that feel nicely settled, if there's parts that are still holding a little bit of energy. And I have to say there's a nice settle, right? And I've learned that sometimes if I talk through that settle, I'm just saying things that because I feel like I have to, I'm overriding myself.
Yeah.
Right. And so right now there's just a beautiful settle, and I've enjoyed just the inquiry, and I've enjoyed being able to share and wanting it to kind of land where it is.
Well, that's a lovely way to model. I'm going to steal that.
Go for it. I'm not saying it works all the time. It took me a bit to get to the point where I was like, let your body tell you, but now I'm doing that. And so my sit bones are really settled right now. So I think that's a good sign, right? Not more itching to come out.
Well, where can people find out about your trainings? Because I want to sign up tomorrow.
Well, I do a lot of advertisement through Facebook, but if people are curious and if they want to be on a mailing list, you can go to my website, beckycarterlcpc.com. And on there, you can just put in the contact, just curious what trainings you have coming up. You can request a training. So I've done trainings for groups, for agencies, for folks who are like, I want this information, and, rally people together to get it. So you can get a hold of me there. But, Becky Carter on Facebook, I'm on there. I'm on Instagram, which I'm still getting to know. So no offense if I don't reply to you there right away. It's a brand new world.
And then TikTok, you'll have to do that. Have your kids teach you.
That's my daughter. She makes me do TikToks. Is, the pressure to do the TikTok.
It is.
Gosh, it's horrible. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Facebook's quite the journey in and of itself. But so, and then on my website is obviously like my email and everything, and people can get a hold of me that way. But yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for sharing your gifts today.
Oh, thank you for listening. Thanks for inviting me. And this is such an important podcast series to be happening right now. I'm thrilled to be a part of it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The NARM Training Institute also offers the Inner Circle, an online self-paced learning program intended for anyone who is interested in joining an international online community focused on healing complex trauma. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs in addition to other resources on the website, www.narmtraining.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.